Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
Christmas morning always came with a heavy kind of silence in my parents' house, like the walls themselves were waiting for someone to screw up just enough to justify a sharp remark from my mother or a tired, sarcastic chuckle from my dad. This year wasn't any different, not really. The living room still smelled like cinnamon candles from the dollar store, trying too hard to mask the scent of tension and old furniture. Carol had insisted on matching sweaters, red with white reindeer stitched right over the chest, and Liam, the golden boy, wore his with a smug kind of pride, the sleeves pushed up like he had work to do, though he hadn't lifted a finger since last Thanksgiving. I sat at the far end of the table, which still had the same floral centerpiece my mom pulled out every December, dust and all. It was shaped like a wreath but more resembled a dead animal after so many years of use. The ham was too dry, the potatoes were boxed, and the conversation was a performance we'd all rehearsed 100 times, only this time, I wasn't playing along. Not really. They went through the usual motions. Carol asking about my firm with a tone that said she was bored before I even opened my mouth. Walter pretending to care until I mentioned I had a new assistant, then immediately cutting me off to talk about how back in his day, people didn't need assistants, they just worked harder. Liam laughed like he understood hard work, which he didn't. He had started and failed 4 businesses in 7 years, each one with my parents' money, or, more accurately, my money that my parents guilt me into giving. I once paid off $38,000 in debt he'd racked up from a vape shop that didn't even last 6 months. But I smiled, nodded, took another bite of dry ham, and waited. I waited like I always did, letting them set the stage for the punchline. Carol poured herself more wine, her second glass before noon, and raised it like a toast. To family, she said, with that smirk that never quite reached her eyes. Some of us are lucky to still be invited. The words floated there like an ugly ornament on the tree, gaudy, unnecessary, but somehow impossible to ignore. And then my father leaned back in his chair, rested his hand over his belly, and let out a loud, performative laugh that made my ears ring. "You're lucky we even let you stay here, Lauren." Just like that. Like it was a joke, one he'd been waiting to land all morning. Liam laughed too, shaking his head like, "Oh, Dad, you're a riot," and my mother covered her mouth like she was embarrassed, even though she wasn't. Not even close. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask them what the hell they meant or remind them that this house still had heat in the winter because of a check I wrote 3 winters ago when their boiler gave out and Liam couldn't cover it. I didn't bring up that the car in their garage still existed because I paid off the loan after Walter had 2 missed payments. I didn't say a word. Instead, I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and quietly unlocked the screen under the table. My fingers moved fast but steady, like I'd rehearsed this 100 times, and I had. I had been waiting for that one final nudge, that one clear signal that I wasn't their daughter anymore, just their ATM with feelings they could mock when the mood struck. The banking app loaded fast. I scrolled through the tabs like muscle memory until I reached the button. I had set it up the night before, double-checked the routing numbers and flagged all the auto payments tied to their lives, utilities, insurance premiums, credit card bills, even the automatic transfer that topped off their checking account every Friday morning like clockwork. They never thanked me. Not once. Transfer complete, the screen said in a soft, green glow. A month's worth of automatic payments now diverted to a holding account under my name. The joint checking was frozen. The access to my business account, where Liam was listed as a consultant for tax purposes, was revoked. My lawyer would send the paperwork tomorrow morning. I'd paid extra to make sure it arrived before noon. I looked up from my phone, smiled just enough to look polite, and reached for another bite of boxed potatoes. My father was still chuckling, wiping at the corner of his mouth with a napkin, as if he'd just told the funniest joke of the year. The truth was, he had no idea how good the punchline was about to get. And I wasn't laughing. Not anymore. It didn't start with the mortgage or the credit cards or the back alley deals Liam called startups and my parents called his calling. It started smaller, more insidious, an unpaid electric bill here, a hospital copay there, a car repair they forgot to budget for. Back then, I was 25, 2 years into my first promotion, still renting a one-bedroom apartment that overlooked a brick wall in a part of town where sirens outnumbered sleep. I remember my mom's voice over the phone that first time, trembling just enough to make me picture her crying into the receiver, even though I knew damn well she wasn't. She never cried. She calculated. "Sweetie," she said, like I was still in braces and not in heels every day managing 3 departments. "Your dad's been so stressed about this mortgage payment. I'm honestly worried about his heart." That was the hook, always his health. Always this looming threat that something permanent might happen if I didn't help right now. Today, no time to think. So I wired the money. $800. Not a big deal at the time, and maybe it wouldn't have been if it ended there. But it never ends at one favor with people like them. Because when you say yes once, they don't hear help, they hear ownership. They hear a door open and they start walking through it, dragging in suitcases filled with expectations you never agreed to carry. Over the next 10 years, I gave them about $350 million. Yes, I know how that sounds outrageous. I didn't give them that. I gave them $350,000. Still outrageous, but at least within the bounds of physics and my tax bracket. It started with the mortgage and ended with me silently financing my brother's third failed business idea, a luxury food truck that served grass-fed sliders and homemade lavender lemonade. It didn't even last one summer. But when it folded, Liam looked at me like it was my fault he couldn't manage inventory or marketing or show up to the truck before noon. The thing is, I never agreed to be their personal bank. But saying no to my parents felt like betraying some invisible contract they made me sign the moment I was born. They never said thank you in words, but they did offer guilt in heaps, and they made sure I always remembered who I would have been without them. According to them, no one. Just a scared little girl who couldn't even tie her own shoes without help. Never mind the firm I built, or the clients who trusted me with their retirement funds, or the fact that while Liam was high-fiving frat bros over branding, I was working 12-hour days cleaning up other people's financial disasters, mine included. They made me believe I owed them. For my life, for my education, for not kicking me out at 17 when I said I wanted to major in economics instead of nursing. They told me I had no gratitude. But what they meant was, no obedience. And I carried that weight, quietly, year after year, check after check. I paid off their second mortgage when they refinanced without understanding the paperwork. I footed the bill when Liam crashed his leased Audi and decided not to tell insurance because it wasn't that bad. I bought them a generator during the blackout winter 2 years ago, and they told the neighbors they'd saved up for it themselves, proudly. But the worst was the surgery. My father had ignored his doctor's warnings for years. His diet was a disaster, his blood pressure climbed like a stock ticker during a panic, and when he finally needed heart surgery, the insurance lapse was apparently a clerical error. A clerical error that cost me $42,000. I wired it without blinking. No GoFundMe, no plea to the family, just a clean transfer, and not one person said thank you. That was the moment I realized I wasn't helping, I was enabling. I wasn't the savior. I was the crutch, the safety net, the walking apology for their financial recklessness. So this time, when my father laughed in my face over dry ham and old cranberry sauce, something settled in me. Not anger, not sadness, just a clarity I'd never allowed myself to feel before. Later that afternoon, after I walked out of their living room and locked myself in the guest bathroom, I took out my phone and called my banker. Her name was Elena, and I trusted her more than I trusted most people in my life. She picked up on the second ring. "Elena," I said, "I need to cancel all joint authorizations effective immediately. And freeze any outgoing funds tied to account ending in 0745. That includes Liam's business access." There was a pause on her end. "Everything?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Everything. No one touches a scent unless it's through me. And for the first time in over a decade, I felt something I couldn't quite name at first, like a cold wind passing through a room sealed too tight for too long. It felt like freedom, maybe even power. But most of all, it felt overdue. The air in the living room had that fake warmth people confuse with tradition, the kind that comes from old space heaters and older grudges, wrapped in the illusion of family togetherness. The Christmas tree in the corner blinked unevenly, one string of lights burn out, casting half of it in shadow. There were too many ornaments on one side, just like every year, and my mother insisted it looked better that way because asymmetry is artistic. Lauren, try to keep up. The gifts were piled beneath it, wrapped haphazardly in clashing paper, some with tags falling off, others addressed in my mother's tight, sharp handwriting that always looked like it was scolding the page. We sat in our usual spots, Liam on the floor near the tree like a 6-year-old who never outgrew the center of attention, my father in his recliner, and my mother perched on the edge of the couch like she was about to direct a theater production. I handed out gifts carefully, one by one, each wrapped with thought and ribbon, each chosen to reflect something real. I had spent time on these like I always did, because even if they never appreciated it, I couldn't stand the idea of becoming like them, careless, transactional, dismissive. Liam got a signed first edition of that graphic novel series he loved in college, but always said was too expensive to collect. My mother received a cashmere wrap in her favorite shade of navy blue, which I had custom ordered and monogrammed with her initials. My father got a vintage watch, the same model he'd lost years ago on a fishing trip and had brought up at least 27 times since, each time with a laugh that didn't quite hide the regret. Their faces lit up, briefly, predictably, and then dimmed just as fast, like gratitude was a candle they couldn't let burn for too long. Then it was my turn. Carol passed me a flat white envelope, no bow, no tag. Just folded once and sealed with the kind of tape you use when you're out of the good kind, but don't care enough to go to the store. I opened it slowly, already bracing for disappointment, and found a $5 Starbucks card tucked inside, along with a note scribbled on the back of a receipt from Walgreens. "You already have everything, sweetheart," it said. We didn't want to waste money. Then they laughed. All of them. Even Liam, who still owed me 15 grand from the last emergency I covered for him. My father laughed loudest, slapping his knee like he'd just watched a stand-up special. My mother giggled behind her wine glass, red lipstick smeared on the rim, her teeth just slightly stained. I smiled. Or at least, I moved the muscles that suggested a smile. It felt like pulling a sheet over a corpse and pretending it was asleep. I held the envelope between two fingers, set it gently on the coffee table, and said, "How thoughtful," in a voice that could have frozen boiling water. And then I reached for my purse. "I actually have one more gift," I said, loud enough to interrupt my father's laughter, quiet enough that it made them all lean in just slightly. "It's for you, Dad. And it's special." I pulled out the manila folder I'd kept zipped in my bag since that morning. It was thick, thicker than it should have been for a holiday gift, and the edges were slightly curled from my grip. I handed it to him without ceremony. "Merry Christmas," I said. "I think you'll find this enlightening." He opened it slowly, his expression shifting from amusement to confusion to something colder. Inside were printed bank statements, all neatly ordered, each transaction highlighted and annotated. Every transfer. Every payment. Every dollar that had passed from my account into theirs, directly or indirectly, over the last 12 years. Pages and pages of it, accompanied by a notarized letter from my lawyer that terminated all informal financial arrangements, effective immediately. This can't be right," he muttered, flipping through the pages like they were in a language he didn't understand. "It's all there," I said, sipping from my wine glass without breaking eye contact. "Every cent. Every time you said you'd pay me back and didn't. Every time you said you were in a tight spot, and I covered it without question." My mother leaned over his shoulder, her face suddenly pinched and pale, like someone had turned off the heat in the room. And what the hell is this clause? My father asked, jabbing a finger at the last page. That's the termination clause, I said, letting the words settle like dust on old furniture. It means this is done. No more money. No more shared accounts. No more favors. If you want to buy a new recliner or bail Liam out of another dumbass venture, you'll need to do it on your own. There was a silence after that, thick and brittle, like the air had turned to glass. No one moved. No one breathed. Finally, my father looked up, his face pale, his lips slightly parted like he wanted to say something but had forgotten how. "What is this?" he whispered, almost like he was afraid of the answer. I took another sip of wine, leaned back into the couch cushions, and smiled, this time for real. "It's Independence," I said softly. "Happy holidays." It didn't take long for the yelling to start, though I admit I thought it would be my father who cracked first, not Liam, who always played the victim so convincingly. He probably believed it himself by now. But no, it was him who lost it first, his voice rising in that childish, panicked way that men get when they realize the leash they've been yanking for years has suddenly vanished. The sound of his boots storming down the hallway was hard to ignore, thudding like a toddler throwing a tantrum in work boots, which, considering the emotional age we were dealing with, seemed almost fitting. "What the hell, Lauren?" he shouted from the entryway, waving the folder I'd given our father like it was a subpoena made of poison. "You're ruining the family." That line actually made me laugh, and I wasn't even trying to be cruel. It just hit the absurdity nerve so perfectly I couldn't stop the sound from coming out. Ruining the family? I hadn't realized that doing the financial equivalent of changing the locks on my own stolen life could be considered sabotage. But sure, in Liam's world, where failure was someone else's responsibility and consequences were a foreign language, I was the villain now. "I'm sorry, did I ruin your fifth retirement fund?" I said calmly, still sitting on the couch with my legs crossed, swirling the last of the wine in my glass like I was watching dinner theater. "You didn't just cut them off," he snapped, his face redder than I'd ever seen it. "You cut me off too. What the hell am I supposed to do now?" I looked at him for a long moment, honestly surprised at how unbothered I felt by his rage. Maybe a year ago I would have cried, would have felt guilty, would have tried to explain or apologize or offer some middle ground. But today, I didn't owe Liam explanations. I owed myself freedom. "You get a job," I said, slowly and clearly, like I was talking to someone who'd never heard the term before. "You get a job that pays actual money, and you stop pretending to be the second coming of Steve Jobs just because you can design a shitty logo in Canva." His jaw dropped, and for a second he looked like he might actually throw the folder at me. He clutched it tighter instead, the pages crumpling in his hands like crutches snapping under their own weight. "This is unbelievable," he said, pacing like a cartoon character whose steam engine brain couldn't pick a direction. "You're seriously acting like you're better than all of us?" "No," I said, "I'm just done being worse off because of you." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't stand. I just let the words fall into the room and stay there, thick and undeniable, like the mildew smell in the basement we all used to pretend wasn't there during childhood. That's when my father tried to intervene, his tone suddenly conciliatory, as if I'd just made a small mistake that could be corrected with the right amount of guilt. "Lauren, honey," he started, that fake warmth crawling up his throat like syrup over gravel, "you've always been the responsible one. That's what families are about, taking care of each other. You know that." I met his eyes without flinching. I did take care of everyone. For over a decade. And not once did anyone take care of me. The silence that followed was somehow louder than Liam's tantrum. My mother wasn't even looking at me anymore. She was staring out the window like she was trying to blink her way into another version of this moment. One where her daughter didn't just dismantle the family's carefully built web of denial in less than 20 minutes. But the truth is, this had been a long time coming. Because what no one in that room knew yet, what none of them had even suspected, was that I didn't just stop the bleeding. I went after the wound. 2 weeks earlier, after a night spent reviewing financial documents my father had asked me to glance at, I noticed something off in the quarterly expense logs of his business. It was small, subtle, tiny withdrawals labeled as consulting, petty cash, development resources. But they all circled back to accounts I recognized from my own records, ones Liam had access to. He'd been slowly siphoning money from their company, maybe not enough to be noticed immediately, but enough to be illegal. And definitely enough to get the government's attention. I didn't yell. I didn't confront him. I didn't even hint that I knew. I made copies, I called a lawyer, and then I submitted everything to the IRS. Quietly. Precisely. With every T crossed and I dotted. It wasn't revenge. It was consequence, and there's a difference. Liam was still ranting when the knock came. Sharp. Firm. Official. We all turned at the same time, the whole family frozen like mannequins in a store window. 3 more knocks, followed by the sound of a doorbell none of us had heard in hours. My father stood up first, but I was already walking toward the foyer. By the time I opened the door, they were already holding up the badge. Liam Mitchell, the man said, his voice clipped and no nonsense. Federal Revenue Service. We need to ask you a few questions. Liam's mouth opened, but no sound came out. My mother gasped, her wine glass slipping from her fingers and hitting the hardwood floor with a soft thud and a splash of red. I didn't flinch. I just stepped aside to give them room. The screaming started before the front door had even finished closing behind Liam and the agents, the kind of high-pitched, cracking sob that didn't sound like sadness so much as desperation finally meeting its match. My mother was clutching the arm of the recliner, shaking her head like if she denied what just happened hard enough. Maybe it would all roll backwards and the day could restart with new, more obedient outcomes. Her lipstick was smudged, her mascara trailing down the sides of her face like 2 black tears that wouldn't dry. She looked less like a wounded mother and more like an actress who just realized the play had closed and no one told her. My father wasn't moving much at all, just standing behind her, his face more pale than I'd ever seen it, as if all the blood had dropped out of him in a rush and hadn't bothered to return. He wasn't yelling, wasn't demanding explanations, wasn't calling out my name with that passive-aggressive snap he used when he needed something and wanted to pretend he didn't. He was just quiet. That was more unnerving than the sobs. Walter Mitchell had always been full of words, full of pointed little speeches and condescending chuckles, but now his silence stretched so wide across the room, it felt like it might swallow the whole damn house. I sat back down in my chair, the same chair I'd been in when he made the joke that started all of this, though of course it didn't start there, not really. That moment was just the lid finally blowing off the pressure cooker they'd kept on the stove for years, convincing me it was dinner and not disaster. The coffee in my mug was cold now, but I took a sip anyway, staring out the window as if nothing around me had changed. In some ways, it hadn't. They were still the same people, still clinging to their delusions, still standing in the ruins of a fantasy where they were owed something from me just for being my parents. My mother, between sobs, finally found her voice again, though it trembled like wet cardboard. "How could you do this, Lauren?" she wailed, her voice scraping at the air like a rusted knife. "How could you embarrass your family like this on Christmas?" I turned to look at her fully now, not with pity or anger, but with the kind of steady calm that comes only after surviving 100 small cuts and realizing you don't bleed for them anymore. "I didn't embarrass anyone," I said, keeping my voice low so it cut through the chaos like a blade through butter. "I just stopped covering for everyone else's mess." Her mouth opened and closed, like she was searching for a comeback, a guilt trip, maybe even a little weaponized nostalgia, but nothing came. That well was dry now. She had used every trick, every sigh, every sentence that began with "after everything we've done for you." And none of it worked anymore. My father finally sat down. Not in his usual confident sprawl, but slowly, like a man unsure if the furniture would still support him. He didn't look at me, just stared down at the carpet like he was hoping for answers between the fibers. I stood then, folding my napkin carefully and placing it next to my untouched plate. The ham had gone cold, the potatoes had crusted over, and the cranberry sauce had begun to dry at the edges, like even the food knew it had overstayed its welcome. I walked over to my mother, leaned down, and kissed her gently on the cheek. She flinched, like she wasn't sure if it was affection or judgment. Maybe it was both. "Thank you for the hospitality," I said, each word precise, smooth, and unshakable. "And for the clarity." She looked up at me, eyes rimmed red, mascara flaking onto her cheeks. But she didn't say anything. Maybe she finally knew there was nothing left to say. As I walked to the door, my father finally looked up. His mouth twitched, like he might say my name. But the sound never made it out. Maybe he realized it wouldn't change anything. Maybe, for once in his life, he finally saw me not as the obedient daughter, not as the wallet with legs, but as someone he no longer understood. The cold outside hit me like a second breath I didn't know I'd been holding. The sky had dimmed, the sun slipping behind the trees in that soft winter way that makes everything look like it's waiting for something else to happen. I unlocked my car, sat inside, and closed the door with a finality that felt like a punctuation mark. Then I pulled out my phone. The screen lit up with a new notification, email from the real estate agency. The subject line made me exhale, not from surprise, but from relief. Offer accepted. The house I'd looked at 3 towns over, with the wide kitchen, the fenced yard, and the tiny sunroom I had already imagined turning into a reading nook. No shared mortgage. No co-signed loans. No one else's name on the mailbox. Just mine. I leaned back in the seat, watching the empty road stretch out before me, the weight in my chest finally shifting into something I could carry. Maybe even something I could leave behind. Funny thing about freedom, it never shows up screaming. Sometimes it just walks away. And maybe, just maybe, that's not cruel. Maybe it's the kindest thing I've ever done for myself.